The reluctant stand-in Seattle. Rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of David Sterling's corner office on the 42nd floor. At the 32, he commanded one of the fastest-growing tech empires on the West Coast. But tonight, all he wanted was to go home to his penthouse and forget the world existed. His best friend Jason had other plans. "Come on, David, it's just one dinner," Jason pleaded through the phone, his voice carrying that familiar tone of desperation. "Rachel's been looking forward to this for weeks. Can't just cancel now because of some emergency client meeting." David loosened his tie and stared out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the early evening darkness. "Why me? Can't you reschedule?" "The client flew in from Tokyo specifically for tonight. This deal could make or break my firm." Jason's architectural company had been struggling lately. David knew his friend couldn't afford to miss this opportunity. "Besides, Rachel doesn't know what I look like. I showed her your photo by accident anyway, you what?" David's eyebrows shot up. It was a mistake. I grabbed the wrong phone. "Look, you're better looking than me anyway. Just go. Make polite conversation for an hour. Then tell her I wasn't what she expected. Easy." David sank into his leather chair, already regretting what he was about to say. "Fine, but you owe me big time. You're the best man." Her name is Emma Chen. She's a teacher. Sweet, down-to-earth. Nothing like those socialites you usually avoid. The reservation is at Canlis at 8. After hanging up, David wondered what he'd gotten himself into. His last relationship had ended badly when he discovered his ex was more interested in his bank account than him. Since then, he'd kept his heart locked away, focusing entirely on building his empire. An hour later, David stood outside Canlis, adjusting his charcoal gray suit jacket. The restaurant was known for its impeccable service and stunning views of Lake Union. He'd eaten here countless times for business dinners, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he was pretending to be someone else. The hostess led him to a table by the window. "Your guest is already here, Mr. Chen," she said with a warm smile. David's step faltered. The woman sitting at the table wasn't what he'd expected at all. Emma Chen had soft, shoulder-length brown hair that caught the restaurant's warm lighting. And she wore a simple navy dress that somehow managed to be both elegant and understated. She was reading a paperback book, completely absorbed, her finger tracing along the page. When she looked up and smiled, David felt something shift in his chest. Her eyes were warm brown, intelligent, and completely genuine. It's no calculating look, no assessment of his watch or suit quality, just a simple, honest smile. "Jason," she asked, standing gracefully. David hesitated. He should correct her immediately. Explain the mix-up. Instead, he heard himself say, "Emma, you're even more beautiful than your photo suggested." Slight blush colored her cheeks. "Thank you. Have to admit I was nervous about tonight." They sat down, and David found himself studying her more closely. There was something refreshing about Emma's presence. She didn't fill the silence with nervous chatter or obvious attempts to impress. Instead, she seemed comfortable with quiet. Moments, occasionally glancing out the window at the city lights reflecting on the water. "So, Jason mentioned you're in architecture," Emma said, opening her menu. "What kind of projects do you work on?" David's mind raced. He knew enough about Jason's work to fake it for a while. Mostly commercial buildings, some residential. "I've always been fascinated by how spaces can influence people's emotions and behaviors." Emma's face lit up. "That's exactly how I feel about my classroom. The way I arrange the desks and decorate the walls can completely change how my students learn and interact." "You teach elementary school? 3rd grade? 22 little hurricanes of energy and curiosity?" Emma laughed, and the sound was like music. "Some days are chaos, but watching them discover something new, seeing that moment when understanding clicks." David found himself leaning forward, genuinely interested. "What's the most challenging part? The paperwork?" Emma said without hesitation, then grinned. "No, actually it's knowing that some of my kids go home to difficult situations. I have one student, Timothy, whose parents are going through a messy divorce. He's been acting out in class, but I can see he's just hurting." The passion in Emma's voice when she talked about her students stirred something in David. He'd built his company partly because he wanted to create jobs, to make a positive impact, but he'd lost touch with that original motivation somewhere along the way. "What about you?" Emma asked. "What drives you to create these spaces for people?" David paused, choosing his words carefully. "I suppose I want to build things that matter. Spaces where people can connect, work together, maybe even fall in love." Emma smiled at that last part. A romantic architect. I like that. Their conversation flowed naturally through dinner. Emma told him about her weekend volunteer work at the animal shelter, her attempts at learning pottery, and her dream of someday opening a small bakery. David found himself sharing things he rarely discussed: his love of old movies, his secret hobby of photography, even his complicated relationship with his workaholic father. "I bake as a stress reliever," Emma was saying as dessert arrived. "There's something therapeutic about kneading dough. My neighbors have gotten used to finding cookies on their doorsteps." "What's your specialty?" "Probably my grandmother's chocolate chip recipe. She immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but that recipe written on a scrap of paper. It's the one thing that survived everything else she lost." David watched as Emma's expression grew wistful. There was depth to her, layers of experience, an emotion that intrigued him. She wasn't trying to impress him with designer names or exotic travel stories. Instead, she shared pieces of herself that actually mattered. As the evening progressed, David realized he was in trouble. He'd come here planning to quickly end an awkward blind date, but Emma Chen was nothing like what he'd expected. She was intelligent, without being pretentious, beautiful, without being aware of it, genuinely kind in a way that seemed almost rare in his world. When the check arrived, Emma reached for her purse. "Let me contribute to this." Absolutely not," David said, perhaps too quickly. Emma studied his face. "Are you sure? I know teachers don't exactly make architect money." The irony of her statement hit David hard. If only she knew she was sitting across from someone who made more in a day than most people earned in a year. But her offer to pay, it wasn't about money. It was about equality, respect, and not wanting to be indebted to anyone. "The gentleman always pays on the first date," David said with a smile. "Besides, the pleasure of your company was worth far more than dinner." As they stood to leave, Emma surprised him by saying, "I have a confession. I was dreading tonight. My friend Rachel set this up, and I was sure it would be awkward and uncomfortable. But this has been wonderful. You're not what I expected at all." David's stomach clenched with guilt. She thought she'd been getting to know Jason, not him. Every genuine moment they'd shared was built on a lie. Outside the restaurant, the Seattle evening was crisp and clear. Emma pulled her thin jacket closer, and David noticed she shivered slightly. "Can I drive you home?" he asked. "I actually live just a few blocks away. I like walking at night. It helps me process the day." David looked down the street, noting it wasn't the safest area after dark. "I'd feel better if you let me walk with you." Emma considered this, then nodded. "I'd like that." They walked slowly through the quiet streets, their conversation continuing naturally. Emma pointed out a small bookstore where she volunteered on Saturdays, a coffee shop where she graded papers, and a park where she sometimes brought her class for outdoor lessons. "This is me," Emma said, stopping in front of a modest apartment building. David looked up at the simple brick structure, so different from his luxury penthouse. But there was something appealing about its unpretentiousness, its sense of community, evidenced by the small garden residents clearly tended together. "Thank you for tonight, Jason," Emma said, turning to face him. "I haven't enjoyed myself this much in a long time." Standing there in the soft glow of the streetlight, David felt an almost overwhelming urge to tell her the truth, to explain about the mix-up, to ask if she'd like to see him again as himself. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he said, "I'd love to see you again." Emma's smile was radiant. "I'd like that too." She stood on her toes and kissed his cheek gently before disappearing into her building.
Ow.
David stood there for several minutes, his hand unconsciously touching the spot where her lips had been as he walked back toward his car. David's phone buzzed with a text from Jason. How did it go? Not too painful, I hope? David stared at the message, his mind racing. How could he explain that the woman Jason had arranged to meet was exactly the kind of person David had stopped believing existed? that in the span of one evening, she'd managed to crack the carefully constructed walls around his heart. More importantly, how could he continue this lie? Emma thought she'd spent the evening with Jason, an architect with modest means and simple dreams. The truth was that she'd been having dinner with David Sterling, billionaire, whose face regularly appeared in business magazines and society pages. The rational part of his mind said to end it now. To tell Jason the date had gone badly and let Emma believe that Jason simply wasn't interested in a second meeting. It would be clean, simple, and safe. But as David drove through the Seattle streets toward his empty penthouse, all he could think about was Emma's laugh, the way her eyes had lit up when she talked about her students, and the genuine warmth in her voice when she'd said she wanted to see him again. For the first time in years, David Sterling found himself willing to take a risk that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with his heart. Worlds collide. 3 days had passed since the dinner at Canlis, and David couldn't get Emma out of his head. He'd stared at his phone countless times, wanting to text her, but every message he composed seemed wrong. How do you continue a relationship? Built on a lie? The answer came unexpectedly when his assistant buzzed him during a board meeting. "Mr. Sterling, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's an emergency at Washington Elementary. They're requesting your presence immediately." David's brow furrowed. His company had recently donated new computers to several local schools as part of a community outreach program. But he rarely handled these matters personally. What kind of emergency? Apparently, there's been a malfunction with the donated equipment, and one of the teachers was injured. The school wants to discuss liability issues. David's blood ran cold. Which teacher? An Emma Chen, I believe. 3rd grade. David was out of his chair before his assistant finished speaking. "Cancel the rest of my meetings. I'm leaving now." The drive to Washington Elementary took 20 minutes that felt like hours. David's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. If Emma was seriously hurt, what if the equipment his company had donated was faulty? He arrived at the school to find a small crowd gathered outside one of the buildings. Paramedics were loading someone into an ambulance. David's heart nearly stopped until he spotted Emma standing near the school entrance, very much unharmed, but looking shaken. "Emma." David called out, then caught himself. He was David Sterling here, not Jason the architect. Emma turned, surprise flashing across her face. "Jason, what are you doing here?" David's mind scrambled for an explanation. "I heard there was an accident. I was in the neighborhood and—" The lie tasted bitter in his mouth. Before he could finish, a woman in her 50s approached them. She had graying hair pulled back in a bun and the authoritative bearing of a school principal. "Are you with Sterling Tech?" she asked David. "I'm Principal Morrison." David nodded, acutely aware of Emma's confused expression beside him. "We need to discuss this situation immediately," Principal Morrison continued. "The computer setup you donated shorted out this morning. Mrs. Patterson received an electrical shock and had to be hospitalized. We're very concerned about the safety of the other units." Emma's eyes widened as she looked between David and the principal. "Sterling Tech. But Jason, you said you were an architect." David felt the ground shifting beneath him. The careful lie he'd constructed was crumbling in real time, and there was no way to stop it. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," David said carefully. "No misunderstanding, Principal," Morrison said firmly. "You're David Sterling, CEO of Sterling Tech. I recognize you from the news coverage of the donation ceremony last month." Emma took a step back, her face cycling through confusion, realization, and something that looked like betrayal. "David Sterling?" The way she said his name made his chest ache. Gone was the warmth from 3 nights ago, replaced by hurt and suspicion. "Emma, I can explain," David began. "You lied to me." Her voice was quiet, but David could hear the pain in it. "You sat across from me at dinner and lied about everything?" "Not everything. What I told you about myself, my interests, my feelings, that was all true. Only my name and profession were. Only your name and profession." Emma's voice rose. "Slightly. Do you have any idea how that sounds? You're Billionaire. Looked you up on my phone just now. You're on magazine covers. You date supermodels and socialites. I'm a third-grade teacher who clips coupons and shops at thrift stores. Principal Morrison looked between them uncomfortably. Perhaps we should discuss the technical issues privately. Mr. Sterling? In a moment, David said, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. Emma, please let me explain. The blind date mix-up wasn't intentional. My friend Jason was supposed to meet you, but he had an emergency, and so you decided to play pretend. Emma's cheeks were flushed with anger and embarrassment. What was this? Some kind of game to you? Let's see how the poor teacher reacts to fake Jason. It wasn't like that at all, David said desperately. I was going to tell you the truth immediately, but then we started talking and you were so genuine, so real. I haven't had a conversation like that in years, because you chose to lie. Emma shot back. Am I supposed to believe anything you say now? Students and faculty were beginning to stare. David realized they were creating a scene in front of Emma's workplace, potentially embarrassing her further. Can we please talk somewhere private? David asked. Emma shook her head. I think you've done enough. Mrs. Patterson is in the hospital because of your company's equipment. I have to check on my students and make sure they're safe. The dismissal hit David harder than any business rejection ever had. He watched Emma walk away, her shoulders rigid with anger and hurt, and felt something break inside his chest. Principal Morrison cleared her throat. Mr. Sterling, we really do need to address the safety concerns. David forced himself to focus on the immediate crisis. Of course. I want to see the equipment personally and ensure all the other units are safe. We'll also cover all medical expenses for Mrs. Patterson and provide compensation for any trauma. For the next 2 hours, David worked with the school's maintenance staff and his own technicians to identify the problem. It turned out to be a faulty power strip that had nothing to do with the computers themselves, but David didn't care about liability. His only concern was ensuring something like this never happened again. Throughout the inspection, he found himself glancing toward Emma's classroom windows, hoping for a glimpse of her. When he finally saw her through the glass helping her students with an art project, his heart clenched. She looked tired and stressed, occasionally glancing toward the windows as if she could feel him watching. As David was preparing to leave, one of Emma's students ran up to him in the hallway. It was a boy of about 8 with freckles and a gap-toothed grin. Are you the computer man? The boy asked. I suppose I am, David replied, crouching to the child's level. Miss Chen said, you're making sure we're all safe. She's the best teacher ever. She reads us stories and lets us have class outside when it's nice. David's throat tightened. She sounds wonderful. Are you her friend? She looked sad after the ambulance came. Before David could answer, Emma appeared in the hallway. Timothy, what are you doing out here? You should be with the substitute. Timothy looked between Emma and David with the uncomplicated curiosity of childhood. I was telling the computer man how awesome you are, Miss Chen. Emma's cheeks reddened. Withy, please go back to class. As the boy skipped away, Emma and David stood in uncomfortable silence. The hallway was empty except for them, decorated with colorful student artwork and motivational posters. How is Mrs. Patterson? David asked quietly. She'll be fine. Minor. Burns, but nothing serious. Emma's voice was professional, distant. Emma, about earlier. ... Don't. Emma held up her hand. I don't want to hear any more explanations or excuses. What happened between us was based on a lie. That's all there is to it. You're wrong, David said, stepping closer. Yes, I lied. About my identity, and that was wrong. But everything else was real. The way I felt talking to you. The connection we had that wasn't fake. Emma's eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. How would I ever know what's real with you? You're a billionaire who can afford to play games with people's emotions? I can't. It's not a game to me, David said desperately. Emma, I haven't felt this way about anyone in years. That night at dinner, you saw me. Not my money or my company, just me. Do you have any idea how rare that is? But I didn't see you, Emma replied, her voice breaking slightly. I saw Jason, a nice architect who seemed genuine and kind. I have no idea who David Sterling really is. David felt his last chance slipping away. Then let me show you. Give me the opportunity to prove that the man you met that night, the one who told you about his love of photography and old movies, that's who I really am. Emma was quiet for a long moment, and David dared to hope. Then she shook her head. I can't. I won't be some novelty for you, some normal person you dated to feel better about yourself. And I won't pretend that we're from the same world, because we're not. Emma, ... Goodbye, David. Emma turned and walked back toward her classroom, leaving David standing alone in the hallway filled with children's laughter and dreams. As David drove back to his office, he realized that for the first time in his adult life, he'd found something money couldn't buy and influence couldn't secure. Emma Chen had seen through to his heart in one evening, and now, because of his deception, she was lost to him. But David Sterling hadn't built a tech empire by giving up easily. As he sat in his corner office that evening, looking out at the Seattle skyline, he began to formulate a plan. He couldn't undo the lie, but maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to show Emma who he really was beneath the wealth and reputation. The question was whether she'd give him the chance to try.